Well, thank you all so much for coming to this evening's webinar on heritage values and valuing heritage. I'm really glad to have so many people here with us tonight. My name is Verity Ramsden. I'm the Vice EP Rep and Speakers Coordinator for the ICOMOS-UK Emerging Professionals Group, who have organised this evening's event. We're a group of students and professionals in the early stages of our careers who are active members of ICOMOS. We organise online and hopefully soon in-person events for learning, networking and social purposes. And we encourage emerging professionals to get involved in ICOMOS at every level. We're a fun and friendly bunch and would love to have more members, so please do get in touch with me if you're interested in joining us. But now on to tonight's topic. All the discussions about levelling up that we've heard in recent years have drawn attention to the Treasury's Green Book, which outlines the basis upon which policies, programmes and projects are appraised and upon which decisions are made about what to invest in. The Green Book already contains sector-specific guidance for valuing the impact of interventions in crime, health and transport, and more recently in so-called natural capital for the environment. However, there is currently no guidance in the Green Book to help guide decisions on culture and heritage specifically. But earlier this year, DCMS consulted with Historic England and other arm's-length bodies and then published a paper called Valuing Culture and Heritage Capital, a framework towards informing decision-making. This document represents an attempt by DCMS to develop a formal approach to valuing culture and heritage assets in order to create publicly available statistics and guidance. This will hopefully allow for improved articulation of the value of the culture and heritage sectors in decision-making for public funding, consistent with the social cost-benefit analysis principles contained in the Green Book. But is culture and heritage capital really something that can be calculated effectively? Are economic methodologies appropriate? And how can they be combined with more qualitative approaches to create a robust evidence base upon which to make decisions concerning these sectors? Tonight, I'm joined by two women who are incredibly knowledgeable on these issues. Firstly, Brenda Dorpalen, who is Senior Economist at Historic England and a lecturer at University College London and at the International Training Centre for the International Labour Organization. Brenda has had first-hand involvement in the formation of the Culture and Heritage Capital Framework and is currently developing a typology of cultural services and testing their monetisation with a pilot case study for the project. This evening, she'll talk us through the theory behind the framework and the process of developing it and where we go from here. After Brenda, we'll hear from Kate Clark, an industrial archaeologist with a long career in museums and heritage in both the UK and Australia. Kate has been exploring values in heritage practice for nearly 4 decades now. She introduced values-led approaches to conservation and led early policy research at English Heritage in the 1990s, and led on economic and social research for the Heritage Fund in the 2000s as Deputy Director for Policy and Research. More recently, she has been Director of Sydney Living Museums and CEO of CADU. Since retiring, she has helped coordinate the Visitor Economy Strategy for Wales and the Wales Transport Strategy 2021. She is currently revising the Wales Transport Appraisal Guidance for the Welsh Government. This evening, Kate is going to talk about the benefits and pitfalls of combining qualitative and quantitative approaches to valuation in heritage practice, drawing on the lessons she's learned from her work on transport appraisal in Wales. After the two talks, I'll chair a discussion between Kate and Brenda, and then there'll be an opportunity for more questions from the audience, so please pop your questions in the chat box. But without any further ado, let's go over to Brenda to tell us more about the programme. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verity, and thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure for me. I will share my screen. Do you see it well?
Yeah, we can see the slides. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will be talking about the Culture and Heritage Capital program that we are developing with DCMS and other arm's length bodies. The topic of this presentation will be about the economic valuation of heritage and up to what extent we can value it. The discussion points will be first, how value has been approached in economics, because usually we think that there is only one approach, but there are many, so I will go through them, and we'll relate this to valuation in cultural economics, to go to the Culture and Heritage Capital Program and see how it stands in relation to valuation in economics and in cultural economics. And I will argue that this program contributes to understanding of heritage and understanding that of economics that goes beyond GDP and market prices. I will argue why the Culture and Heritage Capital Program is useful, how it relates with other valuation methods, and the economic techniques, particularly related to the Culture and Heritage Capital Framework and the ones that we aim to implement. And then I will go through the Culture and Heritage Capital Framework, the challenges we are facing, and how we want to address them. So, valuation in economics. So there are three main approaches. We usually think that there is only one, but many economists continue in the line of classical economists, Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, and argue that the value of goods and services is something different to its price. Prices would be gravitating around economic value, and this economic value would be the result of the cost of production, particularly on the average amount of labor that is required to produce a good or a service. The mainstream approach to economics, that is the one that dominates nowadays, considers that economic value and market prices are exactly the same, and analyzes how preferences and the supply and demand contribute to the valuation process. And the intersubjective approaches that have emerged in the last years are much more interested in the evaluation process rather than in the relationship between economic value, price, and it applies or it tries to understand the conventions, that is the institutions and social norms that people apply in each circumstance in valuation processes, arguing that there is some kind of negotiation, bargaining process about which one to apply, and there are intermediaries that would define or would contribute to the valuation process. So how this relates to cultural economics? Well, both the mainstream economics and the intersubjective approaches have been applied in cultural economics, but of course with changes, because when we are talking about cultural economics, we are talking about a branch of economics that is interested in goods and services that not only have economic value, but also cultural value. That is, they have aesthetic, they have historic, social, symbolic values, and their characteristic is that they are the result of creativity, they convey symbolic meaning, and they have some form of uniqueness, and many times can be even sort of subject to intellectual property rights. So this cultural economics is particularly interested in understanding up to what extent this relationship or up to what extent economic value can be really reflecting cultural value. And while some scholars will say that there is no relationship or it's not possible to really, that economic value captures cultural value, most would say that there is a connection. Some would say that this connection is complete. Others would say that up to some extent, economic value can capture cultural value. And this is related to their approach to culture and heritage, in the sense that those that say that cultural values partially influence on economic value are interested in the role of heritage and culture in the environment, in the economy, in society, but also in the intrinsic dimension of culture and heritage, rather than only in their relative position. And the ones that argue that cultural values are reflected in economic value are particularly interested in applying economic techniques to culture and heritage. So where does the Culture and Heritage Capital program stand? Well, basically, the objective is to apply economic techniques to the evaluation of culture and heritage, but at the same time, it's interested in the relative value or how heritage and culture contribute to the economy, to the environment, to society, how it contributes to learning, social cohesion, health, creativity, sense of place, and many other elements. And at the same time, understanding that there is a limit to the evaluation or the economic valuation that we can do. So, of course, there is a limit in all these elements that can be captured and in their monetary dimension, but still we can capture a lot. And with DCMS and other arm's length bodies, we are aiming to create culture and heritage capital accounts to value culture and heritage assets across England, and to produce a set of guidance so that whenever there is culture or heritage that needs to be valued in a project, there is a common methodology that everyone applies, and that enables homogeneity in the analysis. So the objective is to go beyond GDP in the sense of not only taking into account market prices, considering that culture and heritage have a significant contribution to people's well-being, and with well-being, I'm referring to a broader concept that includes, for example, the environment, and considering how culture and heritage contribute to well-being. So, why is the Culture and Heritage Capital account useful? Well, basically, because resources are limited and they need to be allocated between different priorities. Cost-benefit analysis inform decision-making and are used to allocate resources between projects and sectors. Economic valuation provides an homogeneous and comparative methodology to assess the benefits that different projects bring. And in this sense, I would like to reference this sentence by Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner of economics, that is, what we measure decides what we do. And this is a very important reason why the Culture and Heritage Capital Program and the economic valuation of culture and heritage is so important, because if we don't measure it, we risk an under-allocation of resources to the culture and heritage sectors. And whenever there is, for example, a project that involves building a road where there is a historic site and demolishing it, if we don't include in the cost-benefit analysis the social cost of demolishing this historic building, we are doing an analysis that is not accurate, and that may imply certain consequences that would be completely different, or would be different if we would have included the economic valuation of the historic site. So speaking a common language, using an homogeneous methodology that enables to compare and contrast within projects is one of the fundamental aims of the economic valuation of culture and heritage. Does this mean that other valuation methods or other ways of valuing culture and heritage are not important? Of course not. This program thinks that they are complementary. In fact, there's a lot of development of non-monetary valuation methodologies and methods. As we can see in this graph, the number of publications and the number of non-monetary papers that have been published is much higher than the monetary one, so there is still a lot of work to do. And a lot of work also in terms of combining monetary and non-monetary methodologies. So for example, the possibility of doing focus groups, of discussing or doing social deliberation processes can be a very good way of mixing monetary and non-monetary evaluation methods. But of course, there may be others that may be interesting to explore, and from which we could learn and improve our work. So I'm going to refer now to the economic valuation techniques. Most of them are based on people's preferences. These techniques are used in different disciplines like health or natural environment, and is usually applied in circumstances in which we're talking about externalities, that is situations in which the social costs differ from the private costs, or when the social benefits differ from the private benefits, or when we are talking about public goods or commons. All of these techniques have advantages and disadvantages, and there is margin for improvement. And between the valuation methods based on preferences, we can talk about revealed preferences that are based on actual behavior, and we try to capture use values. That is people that directly engage with heritage. And within this, we can talk about hedonic pricing techniques that take into account, for example, two houses that are exactly the same, and the only element in which they differ is the fact that one is close to a heritage site and another one is not. And the premium price, the difference that people pay for the site that is close to the for the house that is close to the heritage site, would reflect this valuation, or this economic valuation of the culture of the heritage site. When we are talking about the travel cost method, we are interested in how much people are paying to travel to a heritage site and for the accommodation that is related to it. And when we are referring to stated preference techniques, these are based on survey questions that are hypothetical, and they try to capture both use and non-use values, that is, people that directly engage with the heritage site, but also people that do not, but appreciate the fact that it exists, that other people can enjoy it, that future generations will be able to enjoy it. And these include from contingent valuation, that ask about people's willingness to pay for the preservation of the heritage sites for future generations, well-being valuations that are interested in understanding how heritage sites contribute to people's life satisfaction, and then transforms this into a monetary value through willingness to pay for changes in life satisfaction, or through changes in the NHS cost linked to changes in health. The choice modeling technique that uses or that tries to assess the willingness to pay for a particular attribute. So in this case, it doesn't value a heritage site in itself, but specific attributes such as, for example, the conservation of a heritage site. And deliberative methods that are a mix between contingent valuation or choice modeling and focus groups, where there is some kind of deliberation between participants, usually applied when we are talking about complex foods in which people may not be clear about what they are debating. So this discussion helps for this. And how does this is linked with the evaluation methods of the Culture and Heritage Capital Program? Well, basically the idea is to group culture and heritage assets that face similar methodological challenges in terms of their evaluation, and also map them to know where they are and to have an understanding of the value in geographical terms. And then the idea is to quantify the different cultural services that these culture and heritage assets provide. These cultural services are processes or functions that bring benefits that have both economic and cultural value, and these benefits bring people's well-being. And the different methodologies to value these cultural services could be cost of replacement methodologies, well-being methodologies, choice modeling, or deliberation methodologies. So the Cultural and Heritage Capital program is at a very initial stage. We have just started with it. There are many challenges we need to address. So in terms of cultural services, defining and quantifying them. Then there is also an issue about the evaluation methodology. So for example, many of the methodologies I have mentioned are based on people's preferences. So up to what extent can we use methodologies that are based on people's preferences and not on the expertise of people that particularly know about the heritage and the culture that is being valued. But at the same time, these approaches are democratic. There is also an issue about the behavioral dimension of this service, because even the same question that is developed in a different way, in a different order, can lead to different willingness to pay. So there is a behavioral issue in how people reply to this service. There is also an issue of how integrating monetary and non-monetary valuation methodologies. Of course, given that this project is national, it's not possible to value all the cultural and heritage sites across England. So the idea is to apply benefit transfer techniques. So heritage or cultural assets that have similar characteristics, it would be possible to transfer the value from one site to another one. But of course, this presents margins of error that are problematic. So up to what extent can we apply can we apply these benefit transfer techniques? And of course, producing robust valuation is costly and takes time. So there is also, this is also another challenge. And there are other challenges that go beyond what is cultural services, like dealing with the overlaps between natural capital and cultural and heritage capital. When we are talking about cultural and heritage assets that are complementary between them and that constitute an unity, how do we value them? Then there is also the issue about time, because usually in economics, with time, the value of goods and services declines, but this is not so straightforward with heritage. Also, the evaluation of digital culture and heritage, the evaluation of intangible heritage is another objective. Then also different types of valuations according to the people's location, and discount rates that may be different because of this issue about value and time. So how are we addressing these challenges? Well, as Verity mentioned, GCMS has published a framework. Historic England has also published towards better valuation, and the heritage and the value of place that has been commissioned to Symmetrica Jacobs, that is about the evaluation of everyday heritage. GCMS is going to publish soon an interactive map of cultural and heritage assets, and is working on some scoping studies to define the most important challenges for the Cultural and Heritage Capital program. At Historic England, we are working on creating a typology of cultural services and about valuing them. And we are conducting pilots to solve in a small scale some problems we are facing. So for example, about the evaluation of cultural services, we are developing a choice modeling technique to value these cultural services before and after an intervention, to also address this issue about value and time in the case of heritage. And we are also developing other pilots. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to reply to any query afterwards.
Thank you, Brenda. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. It sounds like it's been a very long-winded and time-consuming project, but one that's very worthwhile. So I look forward to seeing how it develops over the coming months and years. Thank you. Right, let's crack on and move on to Kate Clark, who's going to give us her views on valuing heritage and cultural capital, the benefits and pitfalls. Thank you. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much. Have you got my screen up and running?
We do. Thank you, Kate.
Fantastic. Okay. Hi, great to see everybody. I'm joining you at 6 o'clock in the morning or something like that from Australia, where I am currently. And that was a really helpful introduction from Brenda, because I think she captured some of the key issues and some of the challenges ahead. And in particular, at the point, of what we measure shapes what we do. So I think the key issues for me is that this is a really important initiative. We need to welcome it and engage with it. It's not something that we can walk away from. But I think that what I wanted to pick up tonight is that I've been working in Wales recently at the other end of the process, using some monetized values in decision-making in and around transport. And it's taught me a lot about what happens when you actually try to apply these processes. And I think the message that will come out of my talk for you is that you as a sector need to actively engage with this. You need to make sure that the heritage services model that Historic England and Brenda are looking at works for you as heritage practitioners. You need to be critical by looking under the bonnet and asking whose values are taken into account. You need to be very clear that this is not policy by the back door. I mean, that quote about measurement is a really apt one. Don't let financial modelling deliver policy by the back door. And user experience, you need to be really clear about when and in what circumstances these kind of qualitative measures are the right tool for the job. So let's just go back a little step to the whole basis of value, because value comes into everything that we do. Sorry, let's just go back. It is fundamentally what people value, and that's what makes it slightly different to natural capital. It's all around us in intangible and intangible heritage, place, objects, and language. It is a contested space, and it is based on conflicting values and complex ethics. It's a strength of what we do, but it's also at the heart of what we do. It's what makes cultural heritage so complex. In the wider policy space, we've now got a good evidence base for caring for heritage assets, delivering wider public value, livability and placemaking, the environment through things like waste, decarbonisation, embodied energy, the well-being benefits of investing in heritage, and of course use values, because a lot of heritage assets are assets that we are still using for their original or other purposes. Which of course does mean that cultural heritage is relevant to wider major public policy issues. But the problem is, as we all know, cultural heritage is often a bolt-on in a lot of those decision-making and policy areas because its value is no longer recognised. So the key point is that anything that can get us around the top table is inherently important. We're not, as a sector, strangers to work on evaluation. I can see that Paul Drury's on the call, and he was around at the same time as I was in a lot of this early work. It really goes back to Rio and sustainable development and the recognition that we can't separate economics and social policy issues from conservation, whether it's of natural environment or of cultural heritage. So we need to be working with development and with economics and with wider social practice, not in isolation. And that's, I think, been a really fundamental philosophical point for cultural heritage practice for at least the last 3 or 4 decades. Hello, Paul. We were doing a lot of work in the 1990s around this. So the then English Heritage Environment Agency and Countryside Commission were working together on quality of life capital work, a whole new approach to environmental capital that looked at conserving things and the benefits that they delivered. So this is really not new. The enabling development policy was one of the first ones that Paul Drury led on, that looked at explicitly setting effectively monetary value in the terms of developers' profit against those wider heritage values. The early English heritage work on sustainability made a strong case for economics, and of course the power of place recommendations that led to what we know now as things like heritage counts were very strong on measuring economic value of what we do, requiring people to take full account of the historic environment and economic strategies, and making sure that we had a good database. So none of this is new. But of course, we use values in so many other ways in what we do, including in how we actually make decisions, which is not, I wish it were, about looking at two things and putting a financial value on them and comparing one with the other. But it's the whole messy process of understanding sites and negotiating transitions through the design process of making sure we've reflected what is important and taking that into account in what we do. And that's, of course, was embodied in the later conservation principles, which really do embed this values-based approach in what we do. As I say, we did a lot of work in the 1990s in and around economic valuation. Gareth was working with me at HLF and taught me a lot about how we can apply this to heritage. And I think in the 1990s, we even came up with an agenda for policy research in and around this place. And it still obviously is happening. So the other piece of work we did in the mid-2000s really looked at this agenda around values in heritage more widely, taking it beyond conservation, beyond significance, to recognize that values shapes what we do, it shapes why we do it, and which shapes how we do it. And we brought David Throsby, the economist who's been behind a lot of this thinking, over to the UK to talk about it. And we came up with a framework for concept of public value, which I know has been superseded, but I still think it's a really powerful one, that says we think about value in terms of the meanings associated with cultural items, and that shapes what we do. We think about values in terms of the wider benefits, the social, cultural, economic, and environmental benefits that flow from conserving things. And that's really where the cultural capital model comes in. It says that we see cultural assets as a form of capital that deliver wider benefits, and of course, how we do it. And the other aspect that we looked at in terms of that public value work was our own values as heritage professionals, and our organisational values. Are we trusted? Are we accountable? And this comes from the work of Mark Moore, who looks at public value in the US and how organizational behavior and organizational services are also an element of that value. So value goes well beyond the benefits that flow from investing it, but that's really the focus of what cultural capital is about. So I've been working in transport appraisal, which is a very strange place to be, but for some bizarre reason, I ended up last year being the author of the Wales Transport Strategy. And funnily enough, I used exactly the same process that you would normally use in developing any piece of cultural heritage policy, which is to look at an issue and place it in its wider economic, social, environmental context, going back to sustainability, and think about how to deal with it. So what I've been asked to do is stay on and help revise the Welsh Transport Appraisal Guidance, which is about how we use things like monetized values in decision-making around transport. And this is again, it might seem very odd for a non-economist, non-transport model, non-appraisal expert to be revising that guidance. But in a way, it's about making sure that the guidance is actually useful and serves its purpose and helps us make good decisions. So the basics of this is, as Verity and Brenda reminded us, goes back to the Treasury Green Book and all the ways in which we look at how we capture public value through public policy. And there are three main ways that we do that. We do it through how we spend public money, which is what the Green Book sets out to do. We look at it through how we use land, which, as Paul Drury always used to remind me in the 1990s, is about a public interest in land regardless of ownership. And that's how a lot of heritage regulation works. But we've also got a range of other mechanisms that look at the public interest and public value, including things like regulation. So public value and public interest is in the heart of a whole range of public policy. Now, in transport appraisal, we're actually using the expenditure of public money and the Green Book to look at how we can determine value in transport projects. Because they're very expensive and involve a lot of money, there is quite an elaborate and rigorous approach to transport appraisals for UK transport analysis guidance, which includes not just qualitative advice on how you develop a good transport scheme, but a whole lot of technical advice on how you use modelling, and particularly benefit cost ratios. And benefit cost ratios is essentially what comes out of the other side of all this financial appraisal. It's where you add up a lot of numbers, looking at the costs of the scheme and the benefits or disbenefits or losses in the various other elements of it, whether it's biodiversity and other things, and you add it all up and you come up with a number, and that number hopefully enables you to compare A with B, route A with route B. Now, this is an interesting approach to things, but that's essentially how it works. And at the moment, there is monetized values for biodiversity, air quality, and noise, but not, of course, for cultural heritage. So what I'm doing at the moment is adapting this for Wales. And my key thing with the UK guidance is that it is very heavily reliant on monetized values to make transport decisions. My challenge in Wales is, does that help us make good decisions? And more importantly in Wales, does that help us make good decisions that are aligned with our policies in Wales? Now, in Wales, what we've got is the Future Generations Act, the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, that sets 7 wellbeing goals, which are effectively a purposeful government. And the Act promotes an integrated approach that asks us to look at our public policies in terms of all of those goals, including, ironically, a culture goal, Wales with a vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language. So it's not just about jobs or monetized benefits, it's actually about addressing all of that. So I've got to make sure that our transport appraisal guidance addresses all of those things, not just the numbers that go into BCR. In Wales, planning is devolved, so we've got to take into account the planning framework, and we've got to take into account our own transport policies in Wales, which was the document I drafted last year, which puts a lot of emphasis on decarbonisation. So what I'm doing is I'm not second guessing economists. I'm not second guessing, well, I actually am second guessing the use of BCRs. But what I'm doing is developing guidance that makes sure that the use of monetary values in transport appraisal also fits with our policies and appraisals, priorities, helps us make better decisions, design better projects, is relevant to what we do, reflects our goals, is applied proportionally, and is in line with our policy. So I think the lesson from this for me is that this actually is relevant to heritage in the same way as I've got to make sure this works for WellTag, works for Wales. You've got to make sure that the new approach coming from DCMS actually works for heritage. And what transport has taught me is to make sure that the measures are fit for purpose. So for example, in Wales, a benefit cost ratio based on travel time savings doesn't actually put enough weight on decarbonisation to meet our decarbonisation policy aims. So unless we make sure we're careful about that, Westminster will be driving Welsh policy by the back door. Gosh, I love not being a civil servant anymore. You need to know the limits. So benefit cost ratios that rely on monetized values might be useful for comparing two options, but they are, believe it or not, lousy design tools. You cannot use a benefit cost ratio to design a bike route. Do not be seduced by the numbers. You tend to assume, like we all do, that you're not an economist, you don't know how to do this, so we need to take it on trust. You don't. Go back to Heritage 101 and ask whose values and which values are being taken into account in those numbers, and do not let appraisal drive policy by the back door. Now, just quickly, I've been lucky enough to work with a wonderful guy called Phil Goodwin, who's a retired transport professor, and he took me through some of the work that he's been doing, which many of you may have seen, on the A303 as a salutary lesson in what happens when you use transport appraisal in a heritage context. Go and have a look at his piece of work. It's on the Stonehenge site. Basically, what his argument was is you've got to be terribly careful about how you use these numbers. And what he's done is, are you getting, oh, you can see the numbers. So what he did was he went through and looked at the classic appraisal modeling for this piece of road and looked at and without the heritage values in it, and concluded that essentially when you take all the numbers, add up the pluses and minuses, you find it's not a good idea in terms of classic transport appraisal methodology. And this is what it is. You can see how it also reduces things quite simply to fairly black and white categories. Then what he did was we added in the results of the contingent valuation studies that asked what people would be willing to pay to remove the road from Stonehenge, numbered it up and came up with, quelle surprise, a net surplus. But as Phil reminds me, and this is essentially dependent on the questions you ask. Because as you know, the inspector's report recommended that actually this was a harmful scheme. It would damage the integrity of the World Heritage Site. So had you actually asked people, how much would you pay for a scheme which would cause, in the inspector's words, permanent irreversible harm, as opposed to how much would you pay to protect Stonehenge from traffic, you would get very, very different numbers. So I know that contingent valuation is not the only approach, but this is just a lovely little example of how you do need to lift the bonnet on whatever numbers, and you do need to understand how they will be used. So for me, I think the critical thing is it's an important issue, but you need to engage with it. You need to think about what we are talking about when we're talking about cultural and heritage assets, which ones we're putting numbers on. And remember that the ones we put numbers on and we can account for, there are always going to be ones that we don't. The challenge is going to be intangible heritage, knowledge, skills, language, and tradition. And as somebody reminded me this morning, complex issues such as the knowledge that emerges from archaeological assets. So this is important. You need to think about this and be clear about what's in and what's out. We need to begin to think about the values and benefits that flow from cultural heritage assets. We need to remember that, as we all know, that of course they're not just about monuments. Lots of people use heritage assets in all sorts of different ways. Many heritage assets are still in use for their original or other purposes. They are farms, they're businesses, they're people's houses. You know, there are a whole range of ways we need to use it. Brenda mentioned the work that she and Historic England are doing on the ecosystem services model. Now, underpinning the work on natural capital, which has preceded the DCMS work on cultural capital, is a long history, and I mean a long history that goes back about 15 years or longer, from the ecological sectors on engaging with this and developing models that work for them, and in particular developing a model around this idea of ecosystem services, the services that flow from investing in ecological assets. And their model is based on three core kinds of services: provisioning the food, fibre and water that flows from ecological resources, regulating the way ecological resources can help us regulate the climate, disease and waste management, and seen this one before, the cultural value that flows from ecological assets: recreational values, social values, aesthetic values. So this is the model that they use and underpins a lot of the thinking about how values flow. And as Brenda mentioned, we're also looking at one of these for cultural heritage. I think the important thing for me is that the sector in the UK is really clear about that model and owns it. It's really important that you engage with it, that you consult on it, that you think about it, and it works for heritage. So, for example, we've got the idea of heritage provides infrastructure services. A lot of heritage assets, as I mentioned, are in use now for the purpose for which they're designed. The environmental services I mentioned earlier, reducing waste, recyclability, embodied energy, the well-being services that come through people's encounters with heritage, the place-based services that heritage provides around livability, character and amenity. And I've put cultural services here because I think cultural heritage also provides cultural services. You need to make sure that what you do and how you use this, and I'll skip over this because we're running out of time, is grounded in a proper understanding of how, when, and in what way we use concepts of value in heritage. It's not just in the economic sense, but in a whole lot of other ways. And this is essentially a policy tool for helping to capture value. It's only one public policy tool. And we know how difficult values are. We know that they change through time, and we know that they're tricky. Monetized values are not a substitute for good policy, as I'm finding in Wales. Make sure that you've got robust policies in place that show when, where, how, and in what circumstances you need to use these approaches. Otherwise, it will be policy making by the back door. And I think finally, to finish, although this is about putting monetary values on heritage asset, the whole process of articulating value, understanding what matters and why to whom, and threading that into the complex business of decision making will not go away. Monetary values will not make that any easier and simpler. We still need the qualitative toolkit that we started to develop in informed conservation to help us design better schemes, to make better places, to do informed decision making. Monetized values will never replace those, and we must make sure that they never do. So there we are. That's the big thing. It is an important initiative, but it does depend on you engaging with it. Be critical, make sure it's robust, know when and in what circumstances you're using it. But at the end of the day, this is important. It gets us, I think, around the top table for really, really critical issues such as climate change. And if it can give heritage better weight, then it's a good thing. But be very careful about when, how, and what circumstances you use it, and go in with your eyes wide open. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was brilliant. Gave us lots of food for thought, and hopefully lots of grounds for some questions and answers now. So I'm going to start off just asking a couple of questions that I thought of, and then if anyone wants to pop some questions in the chat box, please do jump in. So to start off questions, I'll go to you first, Brenda. Could you tell me a little bit about what the inspiration was for the Culture and Heritage Capital Programme? Sort of what's triggered this process from DCMS and Historic England?
So, well, basically this purpose of being able to talk in the same language as in other projects, in other sectors, being able to have the same, not the same, but applying techniques that enable us to do proper cost-benefit analysis. As Kate mentioned, the Culture and Heritage Capital Framework is very inspired on the natural ecosystem framework on valuing natural capital, and the framework of identifying assets, then analyzing the services and quantifying them to capture the benefits that lead to well-being is the same idea. Of course, when we go to the natural ecosystem services, part of them are the cultural services, and they have been only quantified in the sense of the recreational services, the aesthetic services, but there are many more that have not been quantified. And as Kate said, it's very important that these cultural services really reflects the characteristics and the intrinsic nature of heritage and of culture. You're on mute, Verity.
Sorry. Beside the ones that you mentioned in your talk, are there any other key challenges that you're facing with the development of a Culture and Heritage Capital Framework?
Most of the challenges we're facing, I have mentioned them. So from the evaluation of intangible assets, the digital assets, the connections between natural capital and cultural and heritage capital to avoid double counting the same assets, because many times there are interconnections, trying to understand these cultural and heritage assets that many times constitute an unity, so how to measure them, and up to what extent can we disaggregate the value into different values, and yes, these are the main ones.
Thank you. Kate, question for you. When I first met you, you took your trainer off your foot, put it on the table and asked us to brainstorm all the different values that could be attributed to it. It was quite an introduction. And it got us to think about all the ways that places and things can be valuable and how they can be valuable in different ways to different people. Do you think it's possible to get a finger on all of those different values for an exercise such as the Cultural and Heritage Capital process? And how can they be built into a single monetary value which drives government decision making? Just a small question there.
The answer is you can't, you won't. And I think that was the key point from my talk, that we will continue to need to articulate value and use qualitative appraisal methods. And I'm also learning this from transport, that even if you've got a BCR for a particular transport project, it doesn't tell you whether that bike lane is in the right place, whether it's going to be used. It doesn't deal with the accessibility issues. It doesn't deal with the land use planning problems. So the answer is that this is a tool to be used like all tools in the right circumstances for the right jobs. And it will, you can never put a number on everything. And remember that the things that you haven't put a number on are the things that will be therefore excluded from the decision making. So I see this as like a great big giant wrench, to go back to industrial archaeology, that might just about fit one bolt size on a large piece of industrial machinery, but certainly won't help you make a day-to-day decision about a new development. And I think the other thing that I pick up on is that I think, at least in England, the government is going down a strongly financialized model for a lot of different areas, potentially including land use planning and urban planning, but also other areas. And transport people I work with have commented that the UK transport appraisal guidance is more focused on financial value than a lot of other appraisal guidances. So I think there's also a political dimension to this.
Do you want to comment on that in any way, Brenda, before I go to the next question?
Yes, that I completely agree. That is one specific tool that needs to be complemented with others. Of course, we are trying to develop this tool and this technique, but this doesn't mean we are not taking into account other values or other techniques. And the greatest achievement in this sense would be to be able to integrate both and embed monetary into non-monetary techniques. And as I mentioned in my presentation, we are aware that the economic valuation has limits and that there are many elements that may not be able to be quantified. But it's better to quantify some than not being able to quantify any, because at the end of the day, we need to allocate resources and these are limited.
Very true. My next question is also for you, Brenda. You talk about how traditional market values, valuations of heritage buildings and sites, and I guess also of businesses operating from heritage sites are separate from the approach of the Culture and Heritage Capital. But I wonder how the two interact. Does a building or site's market value, or the value of a business operating from it, also need to be included in discussions of that heritage asset's contribution to the English economy? How do you bring them all together?
So what I was saying is that in economics, we usually tend to focus a lot on market prices, economic growth, and that we need to go beyond the economic growth, take into account how, for example, heritage contributes to people's well-being, to many elements such as social cohesion, mental health. And of course, it's not replacing one by the other. Market prices provide us very relevant information. Is adding to this information other information that is there, but it's not quantified, so it's in the same language, and we can take them both into account. Of course, when we are valuing cultural services, there's many overlaps between them, so it may be impossible, I would say, to add them up without having double counting problems. So integrating them all, probably it's going to be, I would say, impossible. But taking into account these different dimensions is the purpose of the Culture and Heritage Capital Program.
Thank you. I've just got a couple more questions here, so I hope people don't mind if we just run over by a few minutes. But this is a question for both of you ladies. Having read the Capital Heritage Cultural Framework, it seems to require a huge amount of data to be gathered or to be available, both about the places and cultural activities being valued, but also about people's opinions of them, how much they value them, and so on. How do you foresee that information actually being gathered in reality across the whole country and regarding all of the heritage assets or a large number of them?
Well, as I have said in the presentation, one of the techniques we may use is benefit transfer. So when you have, for example, two heritage sites that are similar in many characteristics, if you have done a study for one, you can transfer the value to the other one, and there's some adjustments that you can do. Of course, there's margin for error in this case, and checking the transfer error and seeing up to what extent this can be applied is fundamental. It's very challenging, and it's one of our challenges to do all this evaluation work, and of course it requires a lot of data, but part of this is doing this benefit transfer techniques that would imply not valuing everything. There is also the possibility of doing, for example, there is a very good study done by Throsby in Australia, where there's not a particular heritage site that is valued, but there are some questions about the valuation of a heritage site with certain attributes, so this can be extended. But the idea mainly is to apply benefit transfer techniques, and of course this is something that we have just begun, so it's work in progress, and what I'm saying is of course not definitive.
Okay,
And I think my response is that it's a way of kind of not quite cutting corners, but dealing with getting effectively from 0 to 60 in a very short period, which seems to be the bit of the challenge here, because I know that in the natural environment, this has been going on for a very long time, and it's a very well developed. And I think it's what I mean by lifting the bonnet on the numbers. If we're going to go too quickly with this, we do risk getting the wrong numbers. And I always remember an attempt to do a benefit transfer for a couple of parks. I think it was Battersea Park in the UK and Centennial Park in Australia. And, you know, what a surprise, the two surveys came up with completely different numbers. And I do remember the economists being a bit cross that the benefit transfer wasn't as simple as all of that. So I can understand it, but I think the key thing is to be very aware of the questions that have been asked and the assumptions that have been made underpinning this kind of model, and therefore the limitations that places on how, when, and in what circumstances you use the numbers that come out of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Oh gosh, we're back on recording. Well, thank you so much to Kate and to Brenda for that fascinating evening. Thank you all for bearing with me. I know I've run over a little bit. If you could all just express your thanks to our two fantastic speakers this evening through either thumbs ups or claps, that would be brilliant. And if you wish to fill in the short survey, Antea has just dropped it into the chat box. That would be really helpful to us. So thank you everyone for coming. It's been a fantastic and enlightening evening, and please do attend the next ICOMOS events, which should be emailed to you soon. Thank you so much. Good night.